Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller, where the raindrops whisper secrets and the darkness hides untold tales. Tonight, as the rain serenades the earth, I invite you to journey into stories that will send shivers down your spine and linger in your thoughts long after the night fades. So, settle in, let the sound of the rain surround you, and prepare to lose yourself in the mysteries of the unknown. I've always been a creature of habit. My life was a series of predictable routines, and I liked it that way. Clock in at 10 p.m., work until 6 a.m., drive home, sleep, repeat. The night shift at the printing press suited me. It was quiet, uneventful, and I rarely had to interact with anyone. But that all changed one night, when the silence was shattered by a single, chilling encounter. It was around 2 a.m. when I first saw her. I had stepped outside for a smoke break, the cold night air biting at my skin. I leaned against the wall, exhaling a cloud of smoke, when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I squinted, the figure became clearer. It was a young woman, her silhouette thin and frail, her long hair hanging limply around her shoulders. She was dressed in a tattered dress that seemed too large for her frame, the fabric swaying unnaturally in the windless night. My first instinct was to ignore her. I wasn't the type to get involved in other people's business, especially not in the middle of the night. But as I turned to go back inside, she called out to me. "Excuse me." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an eerie weight that made me freeze. "Can I get a ride?" I turned back to look at her, my heart pounding inexplicably. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, deep, sunken, and hollow, seemed to pierce through me. There was something unsettling about her, something that made my skin crawl. She didn't look like she belonged in this world, let alone in this dimly lit parking lot. "I'm sorry," I stammered, taking a step back. "I'm working. I can't leave." The girl didn't respond. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly stubbed out my cigarette and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching me through the windows. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I clocked out and headed to my car, my eyes darting nervously around the parking lot. The girl was gone, but the memory of her lingered, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. When I got home, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. My mother's bicycle, which was always parked neatly by the front door, was missing. The lock had been cut, the chain lying uselessly on the ground. My stomach churned. My mother had passed away 2 years ago, and the bicycle was one of the few things I had left of her. I felt a surge of anger and panic, but there was nothing I could do. I made a mental note to call the police in the morning and went inside, trying to push the incident out of my mind. Later that day, I met up with my friend, Mark, at a nearby cafe. As we sat down with our coffees, I couldn't help but glance out the window every few seconds, my nerves still on edge. "You okay, man?" Mark asked, noticing my unease. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, then decided to tell him about the girl. As I recounted the story, I noticed Mark's expression grow increasingly concerned. "That's creepy as hell," Mark said when I finished. "You think she had something to do with the bike?" Before I could respond, my eyes caught something outside the cafe window. My blood ran cold. There, riding my mother's stolen bicycle, was the girl. She was pedaling slowly, her head tilted slightly to the side, her sunken eyes fixed directly on me. And then, as if sensing my gaze, she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent a jolt of terror through my body. "What the—" Mark followed my gaze, but by the time he looked, the girl was gone. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my car keys. I needed to get home, to lock myself inside and forget this ever happened. But when I arrived at my house, I found my car door wide open, the interior untouched except for a single piece of paper lying on the driver's seat. With a sinking feeling, I picked it up. The message was scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "You should have said yes." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I crumpled the paper and threw it to the ground, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I locked myself inside, double-checking every door and window, but sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Her hollow eyes, her unnatural smile, her tattered dress swaying in the windless night. Over the next few days, my paranoia grew. I started seeing her everywhere. In the corner of my eye, in the reflection of my car window, in the shadows of my bedroom at night. I stopped going to work, stopped leaving the house altogether. I became a prisoner in my own home, haunted by the girl who had asked for a ride. One night, as I sat alone in my living room, the lights flickered and went out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. There she was, her face pressed against the glass, her sunken eyes staring directly into mine. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I already knew what she was saying. "You should have said yes." My mind unraveled. I screamed, throwing whatever I could find at the window, but she didn't flinch. She just kept smiling, her hollow eyes never leaving mine. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. The days blur together, and I can't tell if what I'm experiencing is real or just a figment of my fractured mind. All I know is that she's still out there, waiting, and if you ever find yourself alone on a quiet night, and a strange girl asks you for a ride, remember my story, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't the unknown. It's the consequences of saying no. That's why I chose this little cabin in the woods for my college years. It was cheap, secluded, and perfect for someone like me who just wanted to focus on studying and avoid the chaos of dorm life. But after what happened last winter, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same about being alone. It was the first day back after winter break. The snow had been falling steadily for days, and the woods around my cabin were blanketed in a thick, untouched layer of white. I pulled into the driveway, my car crunching through the snow, and stepped out into the biting cold. The air was so still, so silent, that it felt like the world was holding its breath. I unlocked the front door, dropped my bags inside, and went back to the car to grab the rest of my stuff. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Big, strange footprints that hadn't been there just minutes before. They started at the edge of the woods, circled my car several times, and then led back into the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Just the endless white of the snow and the dark, skeletal trees of the forest. The footprints were massive, way bigger than any humans. They were deep, too, like whatever made them was heavy. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the shape. They weren't round like boots or shoes. They were elongated, with strange, claw-like marks at the front. I told myself it was probably an animal, a bear, maybe, or a large dog. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Bears don't walk in perfect circles around cars, and dogs don't leave footprints that big. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt colder than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to distract myself by unpacking and settling in, but my mind kept drifting back to those footprints. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful cry. I sat by the fireplace, trying to focus on a book, but every creak and groan of the old cabin made me jump. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow outside. My heart raced as I crept to the window and peered out. The moon was bright, casting an eerie glow over the snow, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then they started again, this time circling the cabin. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. But when the operator answered, I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That there were weird footprints and footsteps outside my house? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I hung up and told myself I was overreacting. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, always just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, clutching a flashlight like it was some kind of weapon, and waited for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I cautiously stepped outside. The footprints were still there, fresh and unmistakable. They circled the cabin just like they had my car, and they led back into the woods. But this time, I noticed something even more unsettling. The claw marks at the front of the footprints were sharper, deeper, like whatever had made them was digging into the snow with purpose. And there were more of them now, as if whatever it was had been pacing back and forth all night. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving, but my car was buried under a foot of snow, and the nearest town was miles away. So I stayed, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I could hear them scraping against the side of the cabin, like claws dragging across the wood. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but the silence was almost worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, a musky, animal scent that made my stomach turn. I opened the door to investigate and froze. The footprints were everywhere. They circled the cabin, the car, even the woodpile. And in the center of it all, right in front of my door, was a single, deep impression in the snow. It was shaped like a hand, but it was too big, too distorted to be human. The fingers, or claws, were splayed wide, as if whatever it was had been crouching there, waiting. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I packed a bag, cleared the snow off my car, and drove to the nearest motel. I haven't been back to the cabin since. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about those footprints. I wonder what made them, what it wanted, and why it chose me. But mostly, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. And the truth is, I don't think I'll ever know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never look at a snowy landscape the same way again. I feel at home by the water. There's something about the way it glistens under the sun, the way it laps gently against the shore, that makes me feel at peace. That's why I jumped at the chance to visit my grandparents' lakeside cabin last summer. It was the perfect escape from the noise and stress of the city. But what started as a relaxing getaway turned into something I'll never forget. Something that still haunts me to this day. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Cozy, rustic, and surrounded by towering pines. The lake stretched out like a mirror, its surface smooth and undisturbed. My grandparents were thrilled to see me, and we spent the first few days catching up, fishing, and reminiscing about old times. But as much as I loved their company, I needed some time to myself. That's when I started taking the rowboat out onto the lake. It became my daily ritual. I'd grab a pack of cigarettes, a blanket, and a book, then row out to the middle of the lake. There, I'd let the boat drift while I smoked, read, or just lay back and stared at the sky. It was peaceful, quiet, and exactly what I needed. But one afternoon, everything changed. I'd fallen asleep in the boat, lulled by the gentle rocking of the waves. When I woke up, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. I stretched and sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. That's when I noticed it. Another boat. It was small, just like mine, and it was floating only a few feet away. Inside was an old woman, She was hunched over, her face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see her eyes, sharp, piercing, and fixed directly on me. Her lips were curled into a strange, almost grotesque smile. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't seen anyone else on the lake all week, and there was no way she could have rowed out without me noticing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just kept staring at me, her smile never wavering. Then, in a voice that was low, raspy, and sent chills down my spine, she spoke. "A young girl slept in a boat," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "When she woke up, she was stabbed in the face, over and over again." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say or do. The woman's eyes bore into me, and her smile widened, revealing yellowed, crooked teeth. I grabbed the oars and started rowing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. I didn't look back, not even once. I just focused on getting to shore as fast as I could. When I finally reached the dock, I jumped out of the boat and ran up to the cabin, my heart racing. My grandparents were sitting on the porch, sipping tea and chatting. They looked up in surprise as I stumbled toward them, out of breath and pale as a ghost. "What's wrong, dear?" my grandmother asked, her voice filled with concern. I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. "There was a woman on the lake," she said. My grandfather stood up, his expression serious. "Show me." Reluctantly, I led them down to the dock. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. And there, in the distance, was the other boat. It was still floating in the same spot, but the woman was gone. "Are you sure you saw someone?" my grandfather asked, squinting at the boat. "I'm positive," I said, my voice shaking. "She was right there. She said something horrible." My grandparents exchanged worried glances, but didn't say anything. We rowed out to the other boat together, but when we reached it, there was no sign of the woman. The boat was empty, except for a single, tattered shawl draped over the seat. "Maybe it was just a dream," my grandmother suggested gently. "You were asleep after all." I wanted to believe her, but I knew what I'd seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still out there, watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her sharp eyes, her grotesque smile, her yellowed teeth. I heard her voice, low and raspy, repeating those chilling words. The next morning, I decided to ask around the small lakeside community. Maybe someone knew who the woman was or had seen her before, but no one had. In fact, most people looked at me like I was crazy when I described her. "There haven't been any old women out on the lake in years," one neighbor told me. "You must have imagined it," but I knew I hadn't. Over the next few days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I went back to my routine, rowing out to the middle of the lake to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like she was there, just out of sight, waiting. Then, one afternoon, it happened again. I was lying in the boat, my hat pulled low over my face to block out the sun. I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, the boat was rocking violently. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around. There she was. The old woman was standing in her boat, which was now right next to mine. Her hat was gone, and her hair hung in wild, tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were wide, her smile even more grotesque than before. "You didn't listen," she hissed, her voice filled with malice. "You didn't listen." I screamed and grabbed the oars, rowing as fast as I could. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get away. Her boat stayed right beside mine, matching my every move. "Leave me alone," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The woman laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. I rowed back to shore and never went out on the lake again. I spent the rest of my visit indoors, jumping at every sound, every shadow, My grandparents tried to reassure me, but they couldn't understand. They hadn't seen her. They hadn't heard her. When it was time to leave, I was relieved. I couldn't wait to get away from that lake, away from the memories of the old woman. But as I drove down the winding road away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there she was. The old woman was standing by the side of the road, her sharp eyes fixed on me, her grotesque smile stretching across her face. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, but when I looked back, she was gone. I don't know who she was or what she wanted. Maybe she was a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something worse. All I know is that I'll never forget her, or the chilling words she spoke. And if you ever find yourself on a quiet, peaceful lake, be careful, because you never know who or what might be watching you from the shadows. I'm fascinated by stories of the rich and powerful, how they live, how they think, and how they handle the unimaginable pressures that come with their wealth. But nothing could have prepared me for the chilling tale of J. Paul Getty III, the grandson of one of the wealthiest men in the world. It's a story of greed, cruelty, and the devastating consequences of putting money above humanity. It was the summer of 1973, and I was working as a junior reporter for a small newspaper in Rome. I didn't have many big assignments, mostly covering local events and human interest stories. But one morning, everything changed. My editor called me into his office and handed me a file. "There's been a kidnapping," he said, his voice grave. "J. Paul Getty III, the grandson of the J. Paul Getty. This is huge. I need you on this." I was stunned. J. Paul Getty was the richest man in the world, an oil tycoon whose name was synonymous with wealth and power. His grandson, just 16 years old, had been snatched off the streets of Rome. It was the kind of story that could make or break a journalist's career. I threw myself into the investigation, interviewing witnesses, talking to police, and digging into the Getty family's complicated dynamics. What I uncovered was a story so bizarre and heartbreaking that it still haunts me to this day. The kidnapping happened on the night of July 10th, 1973. J. Paul Getty III, known to his friends as Paul, was walking home from a party in the Piazza Farnese when he was grabbed by a group of men and thrown into a van. Witnesses reported hearing screams, but by the time anyone reacted, the van was gone. The kidnappers didn't waste any time. They sent a ransom note to the Getty family demanding $17 million, an astronomical sum even for them. But what happened next shocked everyone. J. Paul Getty Sr., Paul's grandfather, refused to pay. At first, I couldn't believe it. How could a man with so much wealth refuse to save his own grandson? But as I dug deeper, I began to understand the twisted logic behind his decision. Getty was a man who valued money above all else. He was notoriously frugal, even installing a payphone in his mansion for guests to use. To him, paying the ransom would set a dangerous precedent. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he reportedly said. "If I pay this ransom, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." The family was torn apart. Paul's mother, Gail, begged Getty to reconsider, but he remained unmoved. The kidnappers, growing increasingly frustrated, decided to send a message. It arrived in the mail a few weeks later, a small package containing a lock of hair and a human ear. Along with it was a note. "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get the money within 10 days, the other ear will arrive. Then other pieces." The gruesome delivery finally forced Getty to act, but not in the way anyone expected. He agreed to pay a portion of the ransom, but only $2.2 million, the maximum amount that could be tax deductible. The rest, he said, would be a loan to his son, Paul's father, with 4% interest. I remember reading the details of the deal and feeling sick to my stomach. How could anyone put a price on a human life, let alone their own family member? But Getty was unapologetic. To him, it was just business. The ransom was eventually paid, and Paul was released in December 1973. He was found at a gas station in southern Italy, malnourished and traumatized. His captors had kept him in the mountains, moving him from one hideout to another. He later described being chained to a stake, blindfolded, and left in the cold for months. I met Paul a few years after the kidnapping. He was in his early 20s by then, but the experience had left him a shadow of his former self. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and he spoke in a quiet, hesitant voice. "I thought I was going to die out there," he told me, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "Every day, I wondered if it would be my last. And when they cut off my ear, I thought it was over." Paul's life spiraled downward after his release. He turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain, and his health deteriorated rapidly. In 1981, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, dependent on others for his care. I visited him one last time before he passed away in 2011. He was living in a small, modest home, a far cry from the opulence of his grandfather's estate. His wife and children cared for him, but it was clear that the trauma of the kidnapping had never left him. "I don't blame my grandfather," he said during that final visit, "but I'll never understand how he could value money over family." The story of J. Paul Getty III is a stark reminder of the dark side of wealth and power. It's a story of greed, betrayal, and the lasting scars of trauma. But more than anything, it's a story about the cost of putting money above humanity. As I look back on my career, it's the story that has stayed with me the most. Not because of the headlines or the sensational details, but because of the human tragedy at its core. Paul was just a boy when he was taken, and his life was forever changed by the actions of those who saw him as nothing more than a bargaining chip. And as for J. Paul Getty Sr., he died in 1976, still one of the richest men in the world. But I can't help but wonder if, in his final moments, he ever thought about the grandson he failed to save, and the price he paid for his wealth. I'm a light sleeper. The slightest noise, a creaking floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, even the rustle of leaves outside my window, can jolt me awake. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmares that started after I moved into my new apartment. It was an old building, tucked away on a quiet street in the heart of the city. The rent was cheap, and the landlord assured me it had character. What he didn't mention was the strange feeling I got every time I walked through the door, like I was being watched. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my furniture, and tried to make the place feel like home. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I felt it, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around the room. Everything was still, but the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. That's when I saw her. An old woman was standing in the corner of my room, her pale, wrinkled face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. She was wearing a tattered black dress that hung loosely from her frail frame, and her eyes, cloudy and unfocused, were fixed directly on me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This had to be a dream. It had to be. But as I pinched myself, the woman took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She just kept walking toward me, her eyes never leaving mine. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed, trapped in some kind of waking nightmare. When she reached the edge of my bed, she leaned down, her face inches from mine. Her breath was cold, like the air from an open freezer, and it sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice raspy and hollow. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was dark, and everything was exactly as I'd left it. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a product of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was prepared. I left the light on, hoping it would keep the nightmares at bay. But as I drifted off to sleep, I felt the same cold draft, the same heavy presence in the room. I opened my eyes, and there she was, the old woman, standing in the same corner, wearing the same tattered dress. Her cloudy eyes locked onto mine, and she began to move toward me, her footsteps silent on the creaky wooden floor. "Leave me alone," I pleaded, my voice trembling. But she didn't stop. She leaned down, her face so close I could see every wrinkle, every imperfection in her pale skin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered again, her breath icy against my face. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. And then, just like before, she vanished. The dreams continued night after night, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. I started dreading sleep, staying up as late as I could to avoid the inevitable. But no matter how hard I tried, I always ended up in that same nightmare, face to face with the old woman. One night, something changed. The dreams started the same way. The cold draft, the heavy presence, the old woman appearing in the corner of my room. But this time, she didn't just whisper. She leaned in close, her lips brushing against my ear, and began to speak. I couldn't make out the words at first. They were soft, almost inaudible, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I strained to listen, they became clearer. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice filled with a strange mix of sadness and anger. "This is my home." And then, just as I was about to hear more, I woke up. The room was dark, but something felt off. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, the lock undone. I froze. I always locked my door before going to bed. I was sure of it. But there it was, standing open, the key still in the lock. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I checked the lock. It was unlocked, just as I'd seen. I slammed it shut and turned the key, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? Or had someone, or something, unlocked it while I slept? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I asked my landlord about the history of the apartment, but he was evasive, brushing off my questions with vague answers. "It's an old building," he said. "Lots of people have lived here over the years. Nothing unusual." But I wasn't convinced. I started talking to my neighbors, and eventually, I found an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades. "You're in apartment 3B, right?" she asked, her voice lowering to a whisper. I nodded. "That apartment has a history," she said. "Years ago, an old woman lived there. She kept to herself, never bothered anyone. But one day, she just disappeared. They found her weeks later, dead in her bed. Some say she never really left." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What was her name?" I asked. The woman shook her head. "I don't remember, but she always wore a black dress. And her eyes, they were cloudy, like she couldn't see. I moved out a week later. I couldn't stay in that apartment, not after what I'd seen and heard. But even now, years later, I still think about the old woman in my dreams. Was she a ghost, trapped in the place she once called home? Or was she just a figment of my imagination, a product of stress and fear? I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain, I'll never forget her face, her voice, or the chilling words she whispered in my ear. And if you ever find yourself in an old apartment, feeling like you're being watched, don't ignore it. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and the people who live there never really leave. I find comfort in nature. There's something about the quiet rustle of leaves, the crisp scent of pine, and the sight of wildlife roaming freely that helps me forget the chaos of everyday life. That's why I started driving through the deer reserve on my way home from work. It was a detour, sure, but it was worth it for the peace it brought me. The reserve was a sprawling expanse of forest and meadows, home to hundreds of deer. I'd often stop my car to watch them graze or dart through the trees, their movements graceful and serene. But one day, everything changed. It started with the sign. I was driving through the reserve, as I always did, when I noticed something new. A large, weathered sign posted at the entrance. The paint was peeling, and the words were faded, but I could still make them out. Warning: do not stop your vehicle after sunset. Do not approach the deer. Do not make direct eye contact with the alpha stag. If you hear unusual sounds, leave immediately. I chuckled to myself. It seemed like the kind of over-the-top warning you'd see in a horror movie, not in a real-life nature reserve. Still, something about it gave me pause. The rules were oddly specific, almost as if they were written by someone who had experienced something unnatural. I shook off the feeling and continued driving, but I couldn't get the sign out of my head. A few nights later, I found myself driving through the reserve again. It was late, and the sun had already set, casting long shadows across the road. I knew I should have gone straight home, but I couldn't resist the urge to take the scenic route. As I rounded a bend, I saw them, a group of deer standing in the middle of the road. I slowed to a stop, my headlights illuminating their sleek, brown coats. They didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with their dark, unblinking eyes. I remembered the sign, "Do not stop your vehicle after sunset." But it was too late. I was already stopped, and the deer showed no signs of moving. I honked my horn, hoping to scare them off, but they didn't flinch. That's when I noticed something strange. The deer weren't standing on all fours. They were upright, balanced on their hind legs like humans. Their front legs hung limply at their sides, and their heads tilted at unnatural angles. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to capture what I was seeing. But before I could, the deer began to move. They shuffled toward my car, their movements jerky and mechanical. I could hear the sound of their hooves scraping against the asphalt, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I slammed on the gas, my tires screeching as I sped past them. In the rearview mirror, I saw the deer turn to watch me go, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination fueled by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the reserve. But deep down, I knew it was real. The next day, I returned to the reserve during daylight hours, determined to prove to myself that what I'd seen was just a hallucination. I brought a pair of binoculars and parked my car near the edge of the forest. Everything seemed normal at first. The deer grazed peacefully, their movements graceful and natural. But as the sun began to set, I noticed something unusual. A group of deer from the eastern part of the reserve began to gather near the tree line. They moved differently from the others, more deliberately, almost purposefully. I raised my binoculars to get a closer look, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The deer were standing on their hind legs, their front legs dangling like arms. They moved in unison, forming a circle around a large, imposing stag, the alpha. I watched in horror as the ritual unfolded. The deer began to chant, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. Then, one of the deer stepped forward and lunged at the alpha stag, its teeth sinking into the animal's throat. The alpha stag let out a blood-curdling scream as the other deer descended on it, tearing it apart with their teeth and hooves. The ground was soon stained with blood, and the air was filled with the sound of ripping flesh and snapping bones. I lowered my binoculars, my hands trembling. This wasn't natural. It wasn't possible. And then, as if sensing my presence, the deer turned to look at me. Every single one of them, dozens of deer, stopped what they were doing and stared directly at me. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their mouths were stained with blood. I dropped the binoculars and scrambled into my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I sped away. The image of the deer's glowing eyes burned into my mind. I never went back to the reserve after that. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I felt a cold, creeping dread that I couldn't shake. I tried to tell people what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They said it was just my imagination, a product of stress or exhaustion. But I know what I saw. The deer in that reserve aren't normal. There's something else, something ancient and malevolent. And the warning sign at the entrance wasn't just for show. If you ever find yourself driving through a deer reserve and you see a sign with strange, specific rules, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, the things that lurk in the shadows aren't what they seem. And if you hear the sound of hooves scraping against the asphalt, or see a group of deer standing on their hind legs, don't stop. Don't look back. Just drive. Because once they see you, they'll never let you go. It was a cold November night in 1982, and I was working the graveyard shift at the local gas station. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the quiet solitude of the late hours. That night, however, the solitude turned into something far more sinister. A nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Kelly Bergdove, and this is my story. The evening started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., stocked the shelves, and settled behind the counter with a cup of coffee and a book. The gas station was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and the occasional passing car. It was isolated, but I never felt unsafe until that night. Around 2 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard, and he had a strange, unsettling energy about him. He didn't buy anything, just wandered around the store, picking up items and putting them back down. I tried to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. After what felt like an eternity, he finally approached the counter. "You're here all alone, huh?" he said, his voice low and menacing. I forced a smile, trying to stay calm. "Just doing my job. Can I help you with something?" He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You're real pretty. You know that?" My heart started to race. I glanced at the phone behind the counter, wondering if I should call the police. But before I could make a move, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. "Let go of me," I shouted, pulling away. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "Relax, sweetheart. I'm just having a little fun." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The first call was brief. I told the dispatcher that a man was harassing me and that I felt unsafe. They said they'd send someone right away, but I knew it would take time for them to get there. The man didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me with a smirk on his face. "You think they're gonna save you," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're all alone out here, Kelly. No one's coming to help you." How did he know my name? I called 911 again, my hands trembling as I held the phone. "He's still here," I said, my voice shaking. "Please hurry." The dispatcher tried to calm me down, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. And then, the man started walking toward the door. "He's coming inside." I screamed into the phone. "He's coming inside." That was the last thing I said before the line went dead. When the police arrived, the gas station was empty. There was no sign of the man, and no sign of me. My purse was still behind the counter, along with my keys and my half-finished cup of coffee. But I was gone, vanished without a trace. The police searched the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no evidence of a struggle. It was like I had simply disappeared into thin air. Over the years, there were rumors and theories about what happened to me. Some people thought I had run away, tired of my mundane life. Others believed I had been abducted by a serial killer. But the most compelling theory involved a man named Carl, a former classmate of mine who had a history of harassing women. He had been seen near the gas station that night, and his behavior had always been erratic and threatening. The police questioned him, but they couldn't find enough evidence to charge him. Without a body or any concrete proof, the case went cold. To this day, no one knows what happened to me. My family still holds out hope that I'll be found, but deep down, they know the truth. I was just a young woman trying to make a living, working a job that put me in harm's way. And on that cold November night, I became another statistic, a name on a missing persons poster, a mystery that may never be solved. If you're reading this, please remember my story. Remember Kelly Berg Dove, the girl who vanished from the gas station on the edge of town. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel unsafe, don't wait. Call for help, trust your instincts, and do whatever it takes to protect yourself. Because once you're gone, there's no coming back. I've always been fascinated by the magic of movies, the way a story can come to life on the screen, the way sound and visuals can transport you to another world. It's something I've loved since I was a child. But there's one sound that has haunted me for years, a sound that I can't escape no matter how hard I try. It's called the Wilhelm scream, and it's one of the most famous sound effects in Hollywood history. You've probably heard it without even realizing it. A high-pitched, agonized scream that's been used in hundreds of movies, from Star Wars to Indiana Jones to The Lord of the Rings. But what most people don't know is the dark, terrifying story behind it. My name is Tommy, and I was a child actor in the 1950s. I worked on a few small films, mostly bit parts and background roles, but it was enough to give me a glimpse into the world of movie making. And it was during that time that I witnessed something I'll never forget, something that still gives me nightmares to this day. It happened on a warm summer afternoon. I was hanging around the editing room of a small studio, waiting for my mom to finish a meeting with the director. The editor, a kind man named Mr. Harris, let me sit in the corner and watch as he worked. "Just don't touch anything, okay?" he said with a smile. I nodded, my eyes wide with excitement. The editing room was like a treasure trove of secrets, filled with reels of film and strange machines that whirred and clicked. As Mr. Harris worked, I noticed a dusty film canister sitting on a shelf. It was old and unlabeled, and something about it caught my attention. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the canister. Mr. Harris glanced over and frowned. "Oh, that? Just some old footage. Probably nothing important." But I couldn't shake my curiosity. When Mr. Harris stepped out for a smoke break, I grabbed the canister and loaded it into one of the machines. What I saw next changed everything. The footage was grainy and black and white, but the images were clear enough to make my blood run cold. It showed a man tied to a chair, his face contorted in fear. He was struggling against his bonds, screaming for help, but no one came. Then, a figure stepped into the frame. It was a man dressed in black, his face obscured by a hood. He was holding a bow and arrow, and he aimed it directly at the bound man's chest. "Please," the man begged, his voice trembling, "don't do this." But the figure didn't hesitate. He released the arrow, and it struck the man in the heart. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was raw, primal, and filled with unimaginable pain. It echoed in the small editing room, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't look away. I watched as the man slumped forward, his lifeless body still tied to the chair. The footage ended abruptly, leaving me staring at a blank screen. When Mr. Harris returned, I was still sitting there, frozen in shock. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked, noticing my pale face. I pointed to the machine, my hands trembling. That film. Who was that man? Mr. Harris's expression darkened as he realized what I'd seen. He quickly ejected the canister and put it back on the shelf. "You shouldn't have watched that," he said, his voice low and serious. "That footage, it's not supposed to be seen." "But who was he?" I insisted. "Why was he killed?" Mr. Harris hesitated, then sighed. "His name was Wilhelm. He was an actor, just like you. But he got mixed up in something he shouldn't have. Something dangerous." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harris shook his head. "I've said too much already. Just forget what you saw, okay? It's better that way." But I couldn't forget. The image of Wilhelm's terrified face, the sound of his final scream. It stayed with me, haunting my dreams. Years later, I heard it again. I was watching a Western with my friends when suddenly, there it was, the same scream I'd heard in that editing room. It was coming from a cowboy who had just been shot off his horse. "That's the Wilhelm scream," one of my friends said, laughing. "They use it in, like, every movie." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "It's a sound effect," he explained. "It's been in tons of films. No one knows where it originally came from, though." But I knew. I knew exactly where it came from. Over the years, I've heard the Wilhelm scream countless times. It's become a sort of inside joke among filmmakers, a way to pay homage to the history of cinema. But to me, it's not a joke. It's a reminder of what I saw that day. A reminder of Wilhelm's final moments. I've tried to tell people the truth, but no one believes me. They think it's just a story, a tall tale made up by an old man. But I know what I saw. The Wilhelm scream isn't just a sound effect. It's a cry for help, a scream of agony that echoes through the decades. And no matter how many times I hear it, it still sends shivers down my spine. So the next time you're watching a movie and you hear that familiar scream, remember Wilhelm. Remember the man behind the sound, and the dark, terrifying story that started it all. Because some secrets are too horrifying to stay buried, and some screams are too loud to ever be silenced. I have a deep love for the outdoors. There's something about the smell of pine trees, the sound of a crackling fire, and the feeling of being completely alone in nature that makes me feel alive. That's why I decided to go camping alone last summer. I needed a break from the noise and stress of the city, and I thought a few days in the woods would be just what I needed. But what started as a peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. It was a small clearing deep in the woods, surrounded by tall trees and thick underbrush. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked a simple dinner over the flames. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet and the cool evening air. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The woods can be creepy at night, after all, but the feeling grew stronger, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the shadows. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Around midnight, I finally decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The whisper came again, this time louder. It sounded like it was right outside my tent. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just silence. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. There was no one there. But as I started to zip the tent back up, I saw it. A handprint on the fabric, clear as day. It was large, with long, bony fingers, and it looked like it had been pressed against the tent from the outside. My breath caught in my throat. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight swinging wildly as I searched the area. But there was no one there. And then, I heard it. The sound of footsteps running through the woods. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. My heart was pounding, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. I just kept running, following the faint glow of my flashlight as it bounced off the trees. Finally, I saw it, a small cabin in the distance. My friends were supposed to be staying there, and I prayed they were still awake. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the floor. My friends rushed over, their faces filled with concern. "What happened?" one of them asked. I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. There was someone in the woods, a handprint, running. My friends exchanged worried glances. "You're not the first person to see something out there," one of them said. "There's a rumor about a homeless man who used to live in these woods. He disappeared years ago, and no one knows what happened to him. But ever since then, people have reported strange things. Whispers, handprints, footsteps. Some say he's still out there, wandering the woods." I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear it, the whisper, faint and distant, like it's calling to me from the shadows. And I can't help but wonder if the homeless man is still out there, waiting for someone to find him. If you ever find yourself camping alone in the woods, and you feel like you're being watched, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, the things that lurk in the darkness are more than just your imagination. And if you see a handprint on your tent, or hear footsteps running through the trees, don't wait. Just run. Because once you're in the woods, you're never really alone. I used to work as an on-call technician for a security systems company. It wasn't exactly exciting work, but it paid well, and I got to travel up and down the country, setting up surveillance cameras and access control systems for businesses. Since I was always on the road, my work issued me a pager. Yeah, a pager. One of those ancient little beepers that would display a phone number when someone needed me. If a client had a real emergency, they'd add 911 at the end of their page, which meant I had to drop whatever I was doing and call back immediately. But in all my years doing this job, I had never received a 911 page from an unknown number until that night. It was late October, and I was driving through Nevada, heading from Reno to a small town just outside Las Vegas. The desert highway stretched out endlessly in front of me, nothing but darkness and the occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction. The only sound was the soft hum of my truck's engine and the faint static of the radio struggling to hold onto a signal. Then, my pager buzzed. I glanced at the glowing red numbers, a number I didn't recognize, followed by 911. I frowned. Normally, I'd expect an emergency call from a client or my boss, but this was just a random number. Still, I'd been trained to always call back. So, when I spotted an old gas station up ahead, I pulled over. The place was deserted, just a single flickering neon, open sign buzzing against the night. I stepped inside, grabbed some change from my pocket, and walked over to the row of payphones along the wall. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper. I dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Weird. I waited a few seconds before hanging up. Maybe they'd call again. As I turned to leave, something caught my attention. The phone at the end of the row had started ringing. I froze. I wasn't sure why, but something about it made my stomach twist. The payphones here were ancient. Nobody ever called them. And yet, there it was, ringing. My pulse quickened as I slowly walked toward it. Hesitantly, I picked up the receiver. Hello? Silence. Then, a low crackling sound, like someone breathing heavily on the other end. Hello? I repeated, louder this time. The breathing stopped, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, someone said, "Don't go back to your truck." A chill shot through me. I turned instinctively toward the gas station window, scanning the parking lot. My truck was still there, sitting under the dim yellow glow of the street lamp. No one was around. No other cars. Nothing. What the hell is this? I asked, my voice shaking. No response. Then, the line went dead. I stood there, gripping the receiver, my heart pounding. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in my truck and drive. But something about the call, something about the way that voice had spoken, kept me frozen. "Hey," I called to the clerk. "Did you see anyone use this phone?" He looked up, clearly annoyed that I'd interrupted his reading. "You're the only one who's been in here for the past hour." That didn't make any sense. Someone had to have called the payphone. Someone had to have known I was here. I turned back toward the door, suddenly feeling exposed. My truck was just a few yards away, but now it felt like miles. I swallowed hard and forced myself to walk toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last. As I reached the driver's side, my fingers barely brushed the door handle before I heard it, the softest shuffle of feet behind me. I spun around, but the parking lot was empty. Or at least it should have been. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My brain screamed at me to get inside the truck, but my body wouldn't move. Then I saw it. Just beyond the gas station's flickering light, standing at the edge of the darkness, was a figure. Tall, motionless, watching me. I couldn't see a face, just a silhouette against the blackness of the desert night. But I knew, somehow I knew, that whoever it was had been waiting for me. I don't remember making the decision to move, but suddenly I was in my truck, slamming the door shut, locking it, my hands fumbling to turn the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse, my eyes locked on the figure outside. But they were gone. I didn't wait around to see if they'd come back. I tore out of that parking lot, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped back onto the highway. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. 10 miles down the road, I saw it. A wreck. A massive accident. Cars flipped, twisted metal, shattered glass. Emergency lights flashed in the darkness, casting eerie red and blue glows across the carnage. I slowed down, my stomach twisting into knots. If I hadn't stopped at that gas station, if I hadn't gotten that call, I would have been right in the middle of it. I pulled over, my hands shaking. I had no idea who, or what, had warned me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I knew was this: sometimes, when the phone rings in the middle of the night, it's best not to answer. The summer of '95 hung heavy in the air, thick with the lazy hum of cicadas and the promise of endless days. Montana summers were like that, a slow, deliberate unfolding of warmth and light. Our town, nestled amidst rolling hills and whispering pines, was a reflection of that pace. Life moved at a crawl, predictable and comforting. Everyone knew everyone. Their histories intertwined like the roots of the ancient cottonwoods lining the riverbank. The annual fishing derby was the highlight of the year, a burst of communal excitement in an otherwise tranquil existence. I was 14 that summer, teetering on the edge of adolescence, old enough to roam free, yet still bound by the invisible tether of parental curfews. My days were spent with Mark and Joey, my partners in crime, exploring the familiar landscape of our youth. The river was our sanctuary, a ribbon of shimmering water that snaked its way through our town. We'd spend hours there, casting lines, skipping stones, and sharing secrets whispered in the rustling reeds. We even dared each other to sneak a peek at the older kids smoking cigarettes behind the dilapidated boathouse, a forbidden ritual that held a strange allure. One sweltering afternoon, the three of us ventured beyond our usual fishing spot. Mark, ever the adventurer, had claimed to have seen a monster trout lurking in a secluded bend of the river, a place shrouded in thick foliage and jagged rocks. It wasn't a designated fishing area, but the promise of a record-breaking catch was too tempting to resist. We hiked for what seemed like hours, the air growing heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Finally, we reached the secluded spot, a hidden haven where the river narrowed and the water ran deep and dark. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender, a breathtaking backdrop to our fishing expedition. We cast our lines, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and our playful banter. We argued good-naturedly about who would land the biggest fish, our laughter echoing through the trees. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced across the water's surface. Suddenly, Joey's rod bent double, his reel screaming in protest. "I've got something. It's huge," he yelled, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Mark and I scrambled to his side, watching as he struggled to reel in his catch. His muscles strained, his face flushed with exertion. Whatever was on the other end of that line was putting up a fierce fight. "Careful, man," I cautioned. "Don't let it snap." But Joey was too focused to listen. His entire being was concentrated on the battle against the unseen force in the water. And then, Just as suddenly as it had begun, the tension vanished. Joey stumbled backward, nearly falling as he yanked his catch from the water. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. Dangling from the end of Joey's line wasn't a fish. It was a hand. A human hand, pale and bloated, with something dark and unidentifiable lodged beneath the fingernails. Joey recoiled, dropping the rod with a strangled cry. The hand landed on the muddy bank with a sickening thud. Mark swore under his breath, his face ashen. What the hell? My mind raced, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank, a discarded mannequin hand someone had tossed into the river. But as we cautiously approached the gruesome object, a wave of nausea washed over me. The air was thick with the unmistakable stench of decay. "We have to tell someone," I whispered, my voice trembling. None of us dared touch the hand. We grabbed our gear and fled, our earlier bravado replaced by a primal fear. We ran all the way back to town, bursting into the sheriff's office, breathless and panicked. Sheriff Brody, a man weathered by years of small-town life, listened to our story with a skeptical frown. 3 teenage boys claiming to have found a severed hand? It sounded like a tall tale, but he knew us, knew we weren't troublemakers. He agreed to go back to the river with us. By the time we returned, the current had swept the hand away. It was gone, as if it had never been. Sheriff Brody surveyed the scene. His eyes narrowed. "You boys wasting my time?" he asked, his voice laced with weariness. "No," Joey protested, his voice cracking. "It was right here, I swear." But there was no proof, just our abandoned fishing rods and the lingering scent of fear. "You probably snagged some old glove full of mud," the sheriff said dismissively. "Go home, boys." We went home, but sleep eluded us that night. The image of the pale hand, the sickening smell, was seared into our minds. The next morning, we returned to the river, a sliver of hope flickering in our hearts. Maybe we had imagined it, we told ourselves. Maybe it was just a bad dream. But we weren't the only ones at the riverbank. Sheriff Brody was there too, along with a team of search and rescue personnel. It turned out someone had reported something suspicious near the old boathouse. They found a body, or what was left of it. The sheriff didn't share the details, but we overheard snippets of conversation, whispers about the state of the remains, about something having gnawed at the flesh. They never identified the victim, never discovered who they were or how they ended up in the river. That stretch of the river was closed off after that. Unsafe conditions, they claimed. But everyone knew it was more than that. The whispers started, spreading through the town like wildfire. Some said it was a tragic accident. Others hinted at something far more sinister. Mark, Joey, and I never fished again after that summer. We never talked about what we saw, a silent pact born of shared trauma. But the memory lingered, a dark stain on the bright canvas of our childhood. Years passed. I tried to bury the memory deep within my subconscious, but it resurfaced at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes, I'd find myself drawn back to the riverbank, staring into the murky depths, feeling a chilling sensation that I was being watched. One night, I was driving past the river when I saw a figure standing at the water's edge. It was motionless, its gaze fixed on the dark currents. My heart pounded in my chest. I slowed my truck, peering through the darkness. As I watched, the figure turned its head slightly, as if it sensed my presence. And then, it vanished. Just like that. I don't know if it was my imagination, a trick of the light, or if something truly lingers in those dark waters. But I never went back to that river alone again. Some things, I've learned, are better left undisturbed, hidden beneath the surface where they belong. The humid Georgia air hung heavy, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and impending rain. It was the summer of 2003, a summer that shimmered with the promise of endless possibilities, a summer that would ultimately shatter everything I thought I knew about friendship, about life, and about the chilling consequences of a single, terrible choice. My world revolved around my friends, Ethan, Caleb, and Noah. We were inseparable, a tight-knit crew since elementary school, growing up in the sleepy town of Havenwood, where the biggest excitement was the annual county fair. Boredom was our constant companion, a gnawing hunger that drove us to seek out our own thrills, often pushing the boundaries of good sense. That summer, Ethan's older brother, a recent college graduate, had left behind his beat-up Ford Bronco when he moved to Chicago. It was a beast of a machine, rusty and temperamental, but to us, it represented freedom, a key to unlocking adventures beyond the confines of Havenwood. One sweltering night, with a sky full of stars and a cooler full of stolen beer, Ethan suggested we take the Bronco for a spin. It was past midnight, the town wrapped in a blanket of quiet, and the idea of cruising down the deserted back roads, the windows down, the music blasting, was intoxicating. "Come on," Ethan grinned, revving the engine. "One last joyride before it gets sold. Let's make some memories." Caleb and Noah were instantly on board, their faces lit by the dashboard lights. I hesitated, a flicker of unease prickling my skin. Something about the night, the darkness, the alcohol, felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling aside. I didn't want to be the party pooper, the one who always played it safe. So, I climbed into the back seat, Caleb beside me, Noah riding shotgun, and Ethan at the wheel. The Bronco roared to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness. We sped down a winding country road, the air rushing through the open windows, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. At first, it was exhilarating. We sang along to the radio, laughing and shouting over the rumble of the engine. Ethan, emboldened by the beer and the empty road, pushed the Bronco faster, the speedometer needle creeping higher and higher. Then, Noah, always the wild card, decided to climb out the window, perching precariously on the roof, arms outstretched like a bird in flight. "Get down, you idiot," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the music and the wind. He just laughed, a reckless, carefree sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Relax. I'm fine." Ethan, egged on by Noah's bravado, accelerated. The Bronco swerved, its tires momentarily losing traction on the gravel road. Ethan wrestled the vehicle back under control, but the near miss sent a jolt of fear through me. We were flying, the world a blur of trees and shadows. And then, in an instant, everything changed. A deer, its eyes glowing in the headlights, darted out of the woods, appearing in front of us as if from nowhere. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the Bronco skidding violently. Noah screamed, his laughter turning into a cry of terror. The world turned upside down. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, and I was thrown against the roof of the Bronco, my body twisting and contorting in the chaos. Then, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I registered was the smell of gasoline and burning rubber. My head throbbed, a dull ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. I tried to move, but a searing pain shot through my leg. I managed to push myself up, my vision blurry. The Bronco was on its side, its headlights illuminating the twisted wreckage. Ethan was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. Caleb was trapped in the back seat, his eyes wide with shock, but seemingly unharmed. But Noah, I couldn't see him. Panic seized me. "Noah!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror. "Noah, where are you?" I stumbled out of the Bronco, ignoring the agonizing pain in my leg. I searched the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw him. He was lying face down in a ditch, a few feet from the wreckage. I rushed to his side, my hands trembling as I rolled him over. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted. There was a dark stain spreading across his chest. I pressed my fingers to his neck, my breath catching in my throat. There was no pulse. Ethan and Caleb had managed to get out of the Bronco. They stared at Noah's lifeless body, their faces etched with horror. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The flashing lights painted the scene in a macabre dance of red and blue. Paramedics arrived, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. They checked Noah for a pulse, but it was a formality. We all knew he was gone. Ethan was arrested at the scene. DUI, reckless driving, manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years, a harsh punishment, but it felt like a drop in the ocean compared to the weight of what we had done. The funeral was a nightmare. Noah's parents, their faces ravaged by grief, couldn't even look at us. Their silent accusation was more painful than any words could have been. The image of Noah's face, his vacant eyes staring up at the sky, is burned into my memory. I still hear his laughter, that carefree, reckless sound, echoing in my dreams. And I still wonder, with a gnawing sense of guilt, what would have happened if I had just spoken up, if I had just refused to go along with their plan. One night, a single decision, a moment of weakness, a desire to fit in. That's all it took. And our lives, our friendship, were irrevocably shattered, leaving behind a legacy of regret, guilt, and the chilling knowledge that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't lurking in the shadows, but within ourselves. The flickering fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to my sleepless nights. It was 3 a.m., the graveyard shift, and I was drowning in a lukewarm cup of coffee, trying to stay awake. My job at the Havenwood Asylum wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills, barely. I was a night attendant, basically a glorified babysitter for the mentally ill. Most nights were uneventful, medication rounds, checking on patients, the occasional outburst. But tonight was different. Havenwood was an old institution, built back in the 1800s, with a history as dark and twisted as the gnarled oak tree in the courtyard. Locals whispered stories about the place, tales of cruel treatments, lobotomies gone wrong, and patients who had died within its walls, their spirits forever trapped within its decaying grandeur. I usually dismissed these as just local folklore, but tonight, the air felt heavy, charged with an unsettling energy. It started with the whispers. I was doing my rounds on the 3rd floor, the ward for the chronically ill, when I heard them. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, then growing louder, more distinct. Whispers that seemed to emanate from the empty rooms, from the shadows lurking in the corners. I strained my ears, trying to make out what they were saying, but it was just a jumble of voices, too low to understand, yet undeniably there. I checked the rooms, one by one. The patients were all asleep, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. Everything seemed normal, yet the whispers persisted, a chorus of unseen voices that sent chills down my spine. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a light on in room 313, a room that was supposed to be empty. It was the room of Mrs. Hawthorne, a patient who had passed away a few weeks ago. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I knew I should check it out, but a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made, just as I had left it. But the light was still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I flipped the switch, plunging the room into darkness. As I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were 3 words, "Get out now." I didn't waste any time. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in the staff break room, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who had written that message? And how? Mrs. Hawthorne was dead, and as far as I knew, no one else had been in that room. I considered calling my supervisor, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. They'd probably just write it off as stress or a figment of my imagination. So, I decided to wait it out, hoping that whatever was going on would just go away. But it didn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, seeping through the walls, filling the room with a sense of dread. I started seeing things too, shadows flickering in my peripheral vision, doors creaking open on their own, the faint scent of decay wafting through the air. Then, I heard the screams. They were coming from the third floor, piercing through the silence of the night. I knew I had to go back, had to check on the patients, but my legs felt like lead. Fear held me rooted to the spot. Finally, I forced myself to move, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the supply closet. I made my way back to the third floor, my heart pounding with every step. The screams were louder now, mixed with moans and cries. When I reached the ward, the scene was chaotic. Patients were out of their beds, wandering the hallways, their eyes wide with terror. Some were huddled in corners, rocking back and forth, while others were screaming at unseen horrors. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the window. It was tall and gaunt, draped in a white, tattered gown. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, glowing with an eerie light. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at me. A cold gust of wind swept through the hallway, and the temperature dropped dramatically. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and the whispers intensified, becoming clearer now, coalescing into a single, terrifying message: "You're next." I turned and ran, faster than I had ever run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was outside the asylum, gasping for breath in the cool night air. I never went back to Havenwood. I quit my job the next day, refusing to even collect my last paycheck. I tried to forget what I had seen, tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination, a product of my sleep-deprived mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something evil resides within those walls. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I still hear the whispers. I still see the figure standing at the end of the hallway, its eyes glowing in the darkness. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that it's still out there, waiting. I'm Daniel, a young man recently hired as a gravedigger at a small-town cemetery. I'm inexperienced in this line of work, but I'm eager to earn, hoping to save enough for college. My boss, Mr. Holloway, is an old, stern man who takes cemetery maintenance seriously. He's always reminding me to keep the grounds clean and respect the departed. This cemetery has a strange reputation. Locals whisper about odd happenings at night. They talk of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and graves being disturbed. I don't believe in that stuff. I consider it superstitious nonsense. But sometimes, I get a shiver down my spine when I walk past the rows of tombstones at night. One morning, when I arrived at the cemetery, I found Mr. Holloway standing before a grave that had been dug up. The soil around the grave was scattered, and the coffin lid was scratched and splintered. There were no signs of a shovel or footprints, just deep claw marks in the earth. Mr. Holloway was furious and blamed vandals or wild animals, but I wasn't convinced. The damage looked too deliberate, too vicious. To get to the bottom of it, he ordered me to stand watch at night to catch whoever, or whatever, was responsible. I was apprehensive, but I agreed, thinking it was just some raccoon or stray dog causing mischief. The incident happened just last week, and it's something I can't get out of my head. That day, when I arrived at work, I found Mr. Holloway staring at a grave that had been dug up. The earth around it was in disarray, scattered haphazardly. The coffin lid was splintered, with wood fragments strewn about. I didn't understand what could have happened. I asked Mr. Holloway, but he just shook his head in dismay. He told me that this wasn't the first time. A few weeks prior, another grave had been similarly vandalized. He suspected vandals or wild animals were the cause, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't think any animal could inflict such deep, deliberate claw marks. Determined to uncover the truth, Mr. Holloway asked me to keep watch over the cemetery at night. I was scared, but I agreed. I thought I might catch the culprit if they returned. I prepared for my first night watch. I packed a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. The cemetery was eerily quiet, with only the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hooting of an owl. I sat on a rock, scanning the surroundings. Time passed slowly, and nothing happened. I started to feel drowsy. Suddenly, I heard a scratching sound coming from a grave not far from me. I jolted awake, grabbed my flashlight, and cautiously approached. I saw a dark figure hunched over the grave, digging with its bare hands. At first, I thought it was a homeless person or a deranged grave robber. But as I shone the flashlight on the figure, I was horrified to realize it was something else entirely. The person was crawling on all fours, moving with unnatural speed. Its fingers were elongated, with nails that looked like sharp claws. It lifted its head, revealing a human face, but with feral, hungry eyes. It hissed at me, a guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. Then, it bolted into the darkness, moving in a way that was not humanly possible. I stood there frozen in fear, watching it disappear behind the tombstones. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. It couldn't have been a person, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something evil. The next morning, I told Mr. Holloway and some coworkers about what I had seen. They laughed at me, thinking I had imagined things or that I was half asleep. Mr. Holloway checked the disturbed grave, but found no evidence of the creature. I insisted on what I saw, but the others grew annoyed. I started to doubt myself, but I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. Determined to find the truth, I decided to watch again the following night. But this time I brought a camera. As midnight approached, I heard the scratching again, closer this time. My heart pounded. I turned on my camera and sneaked toward the sound. The creature was back, furiously digging, its breathing ragged and desperate. I carefully filmed it until I stepped on a branch, snapping it loudly. The creature whipped its head toward me, its eyes locking onto mine again. This time, it didn't flee. It charged at me on all fours. I ran for my life, barely making it out of the cemetery. I reviewed the footage, but the creature was not visible on camera. I realized the truth. Whatever this thing is, it isn't fully human anymore. I quit my job immediately, unable to face another night in the graveyard. As I left town, I saw a missing person poster and recognized the face. It was the same face as the creature in the graveyard. The person disappeared months ago, and their body was never found? Or maybe it was never meant to stay buried. The creature is still out there, digging, searching, and somewhere, in the dead of night, it remembers Daniel's face. The flashbulb popped, momentarily blinding us all. It was supposed to be a picture-perfect moment, the annual family reunion at Aunt Millie's sprawling Victorian mansion in the Catskills. 27 of us, a chaotic mix of ages and temperaments, crammed onto the porch steps, grinning for posterity. I, little Sarah, perched precariously on the armrest of a wicker chair, my pigtails bouncing. Aunt Millie, ever the documentarian, developed the film herself. A week later, the prints arrived, each one a glossy snapshot of forced smiles and squinted eyes. We gathered in the parlor, the air thick with the scent of potpourri and anticipation, to admire the results. That's when we saw him. He wasn't in the digital copy Aunt Millie emailed later, the one she touched up and shared online. He was only in the original prints, a ghostly figure lurking in the background. He stood just behind Uncle Frank, partially obscured by the overgrown rhododendron bushes, but close enough to be disturbingly clear. He was tall and thin, almost gaunt, dressed in what looked like a faded gray suit. His face, though, was what made your blood run cold. It was stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile, the corners of his mouth pulled back so far they seemed to almost touch his ears. His eyes, dark and hollow, stared straight ahead, not at the camera, but through it, as if he was looking at something, or someone beyond. The smile wasn't joyful, or even friendly. It was predatory, a silent promise of something terrible. Aunt Millie, bless her heart, tried to brush it off. Probably just some trick of the light, she chuckled nervously, her hand trembling as she reached for her sherry. But no one else was laughing. We all felt it, a chill that seeped into our bones, a sense of dread that settled in the pit of our stomachs. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the laughing man, as we'd started to call him, was burned into my brain. His smile haunted my dreams, morphing into grotesque gargoyles and leering clowns. I tossed and turned, the old house creaking and groaning around me, every shadow seeming to conceal his lurking presence. The next morning, the picture was gone. Aunt Millie claimed she'd thrown it away, wanting to put the whole unsettling incident behind her. But I knew she was lying. I saw the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at the spot where he'd stood in the photo. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. Objects would move on their own. Whispers echoed through the empty hallways. The grandfather clock in the foyer would chime at odd hours, its deep, resonant bong echoing through the silent house. One evening, I found my favorite doll, a porcelain ballerina named Clara, lying on my bed, her head twisted completely around. The laughing man was a constant, unspoken presence. We never talked about him openly, but we all knew he was there, watching us, waiting. The joy had drained from the family reunion, replaced by a thick, suffocating fear. Then, the disappearances started. It was Uncle Frank first. He went for a walk in the woods behind the house and never came back. The police searched for days, but they found nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. A week later, it was cousin Emily. She went to bed one night and was gone the next morning. Her bedroom window was open, but there were no footprints in the soft earth outside. The fear escalated into full-blown panic. We barricaded the doors and windows, huddled together in the living room, clutching whatever we could find to defend ourselves. But it was no use. He was already inside, a phantom presence that permeated every corner of the house. One night, I woke up to a chilling sound, a soft, almost melodic chuckle. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept out of bed, my bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. The chuckling grew louder as I approached the hallway, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I peered into the darkness, my eyes straining to see. And then I saw him. He was standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in the pale moonlight that streamed through the window. He was even taller and thinner than he'd appeared in the photo, his gray suit hanging loosely on his frame. His face was still stretched into that horrifying smile, but now I could see something else in his eyes, a malevolent glee. He raised a hand, beckoning me closer. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. He took a step towards me, and another, his smile widening with each step. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. But then, I heard another sound, a sharp, piercing scream. It was Aunt Millie. I opened my eyes and saw her standing at the other end of the hallway, her face pale and drawn. She was pointing a trembling finger at the laughing man. "Get away from her!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse. The laughing man turned his head towards Aunt Millie, his smile faltering for just a moment. That was all the time I needed. I turned and ran, back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't see what happened to Aunt Millie. I heard her scream again, followed by a sickening thud. Then, silence. I stayed in my room for the rest of the night, huddled under the covers, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep a wink. I just listened, waiting for him to come for me. But he never did. The next morning, the house was eerily silent. I crept out of my room and found Aunt Millie lying in the hallway, her eyes wide and lifeless. There was no sign of the laughing man. The remaining family members left the house that day, vowing never to return. They tried to forget what had happened, to bury the memories of the laughing man and the disappearances. But I couldn't forget. I knew he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would find me again. Years passed. I grew up, moved away, tried to build a life for myself. but the fear never left me. The image of the laughing man was forever etched into my mind, a constant reminder of the horror I had witnessed. I tried to research the phenomenon, searching online for any mention of similar sightings. I found whispers, rumors, fragmented stories of a man with a grotesque smile who appeared in old photos, a harbinger of misfortune and death. Some called him a ghost, others a demon, some a figment of overactive imaginations. But I knew the truth. He was real. One day, I received a package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box. Inside, I found an old photograph. It was a picture of me, taken when I was a little girl, standing in front of Aunt Millie's house. And in the background, lurking behind the rhododendron bushes, was the laughing man. His smile was wider than ever, his eyes filled with a triumphant malice. I knew then that he had found me again. He had been watching me all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. And now, he was ready to claim me. I don't know what he wants from me. I don't know why he chose me. But I know one thing. I'm terrified. I'm living in a constant state of fear, waiting for the inevitable. I see him everywhere I go, in the shadows, in the reflections of windows, in the faces of strangers. He's always there, just out of sight, his laughter echoing in my mind. I've tried to tell people about him, but they just look at me like I'm crazy. They say it's all in my head, that I need to see a therapist. But I know the truth. He's real, and he's coming for me. I'm writing this now as a sort of testament, a record of what happened. Maybe someone will believe me. Maybe someone will understand. Maybe someone will find a way to stop him. But I don't hold out much hope. I'm just waiting now, waiting for the end, waiting for the laughing man to take me. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that he won't be smiling when he does. The biting wind whipped at my face, stinging my cheeks and tugging at the collar of my parka. Above me, the skeletal branches of the aspens clawed at the bruised, pre-dawn sky, their bare limbs rattling like the bones of some long-dead beast. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white, as the rental car bucked and shuddered its way up the winding mountain road. This stretch of the old Cascade Highway, locally known as Devil's Backbone, had a reputation. A dark stain whispered in hushed tones at truck stops and greasy spoons for miles around. They called it Suicide Pass. I'd scoffed at the stories, of course. Growing up in the shadow of the Appalachians, I'd heard my share of ghost tales, each one more outlandish than the last. But this was different. The air itself felt heavy, pregnant with a dread that seeped into my bones. Maybe it was the isolation, the sheer drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet into the inky blackness below. Or maybe it was the unsettling quiet, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crunch of my tires on the gravel-strewn road. I was on assignment, a freelance photographer chasing the last vestiges of the Wild West. My current quarry, abandoned mining towns. This particular stretch of the Cascades was riddled with them, ghostly relics of a bygone boom. I was drawn to their desolate beauty, the way they seemed to whisper stories of hardship and forgotten dreams. But this trip felt different. An undercurrent of unease had been building since I crossed the state line. The old map I'd purchased at a dusty antique shop pointed to a town called Silent Hollow, nestled deep within these mountains. It was supposed to be a ghost town of epic proportions, abandoned practically overnight after a devastating mine collapse in the late 1800s. Perfect fodder for my lens. As I rounded a particularly treacherous hairpin turn, the road narrowed, hugging the cliff edge precariously. On my left, the mountain loomed, a dark, imposing wall. On my right, nothing but empty air and the dizzying drop. I slowed the car to a crawl, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The wind picked up, swirling around the car like a malevolent spirit, and a sudden, inexplicable chill washed over me, raising goosebumps on my arms. Then I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, shrouded in shadow. It was human, or at least humanoid, tall and gaunt. its form indistinct in the dim light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure remained shrouded in mystery. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, silently watching. I hesitated, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. I told myself it was probably just a hiker, someone who'd broken down and was waiting for help. But something about the figure felt wrong. The way it stood, so still, so unnervingly silent. I decided to stop. I couldn't just leave someone stranded, even if my gut was telling me to drive on. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, careful to leave enough room for other vehicles to pass. Not that I'd seen another car in hours. I turned off the engine and rolled down the window. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Need some help?" The figure didn't respond. It remained motionless, its head bowed, as if it were staring at the ground. I hesitated, then reached for the door handle. "Hey, are you okay?" I called again, stepping out of the car. The wind howled around me, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. As I approached the figure, I noticed something glinting in the dim light. It was a pickaxe, clutched tightly in the figure's hand. My heart pounded in my chest. Why would a hiker be carrying a pickaxe? I stopped a few feet away from the figure. "Look," I said, my voice shaking now. "I just want to help. Are you hurt? Do you need a ride?" The figure finally moved. It slowly raised its head, and I gasped. Its face, it wasn't human, or at least, it wasn't fully human. The skin was stretched taut over its skull, pale and translucent, like parchment. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light. And its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. A low, guttural growl emanated from the figure's throat, a sound that chilled me to the bone. It raised the pickaxe, its arm moving with unnatural speed. I screamed and stumbled backward, scrambling to get back to the car. The figure lunged, its movements surprisingly agile. The pickaxe whistled through the air, narrowly missing my head. I dove into the car, slammed the door shut, and fumbled for the keys. The figure was right behind me, its grotesque face pressed against the window, its hollow eyes burning into mine. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, praying that the engine would start. The car sputtered and coughed, then finally roared to life. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I didn't stop until I reached the first sign of civilization, a small gas station miles away. I stumbled into the brightly lit convenience store, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, looked at me with concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I managed a weak smile. "Something like that," I said. I told her about the figure on the road, about the pickaxe and the terrifying face. She listened patiently, her expression growing more and more serious. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "You saw the miner," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The miner?" I asked. "Yeah," she said. "He's been seen on that stretch of road for years. They say he was one of the miners who died in the Silent Hollow collapse. His body was never recovered. Now, they say he roams the mountain, looking for revenge." I stared at her, my blood running cold. "You mean he's a ghost?" She shrugged. "I don't know what he is," she said, "but I know he's not something you want to meet on a dark night." I spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, my mind reeling. I couldn't shake the image of the miner's face, those hollow eyes and that gaping maw. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired and stressed and had simply imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something real, something terrifying. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I didn't go back to Silent Hollow. I didn't even go back to the Cascades. I drove straight home, my foot heavy on the gas pedal. I never told anyone else about what I saw. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, that they'd think I was crazy. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I think about the miner. I wonder if he's still out there, roaming the mountain, waiting for his next victim. And I shiver, remembering the terror in those hollow eyes. I know one thing for sure. I'll never drive that stretch of the Cascade Highway again. Some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep beneath the earth. And some ghosts are best left undisturbed, their rage forever burning in the dark. Thank you for stepping into the world of the Rainy Night Storyteller. As the rain fades and the night deepens, I hope these stories have sparked your imagination and filled the quiet with wonder. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eerie tales to accompany your rainy nights. Until next time, sleep well if you can.